So this is definitely a whole sort of onslaught of like, oh my gosh, there's all these structures of the brain, there's all these sort of various ways of like the front, the top, and within the brain you have further divisions. And this, not only can you divide parts of the brain based upon directionality and separate them in terms of various lobes of the brain that are also based on sort of these key fissures, the central sulcus, the lateral sulcus, which separates the frontal and the temporal. But you can also divide the brain or organize the brain based on the types of cells that comprise the brain. All the brain comprises neurons, but there's even different types of neurons, and there's different types of glial cells that support the neurons. There's different types of organization of the neurons within various regions of the brain. So another way to divide the brain is into cortex. And this is basically all this folded area right here. And this cortex can also be called the forebrain. This cortex is all of the outer areas, and it can also be called the cerebrum. Okay, this is a little bit like X-Men. And so the cortex and cerebrum, these can be used relatively interchangeably. So this is sort of the outer areas right here. And then the forebrain also comprises the thalamus, which is right in here, and the hypothalamus. Okay? So the cerebral cortex or the cerebrum is all on the outside. The thalamus and the hypothalamus more on the inside. All of these together make up the forebrain. Then you also have the midbrain, which is right in here. And this is very sort of a more evolutionary, older part of the brain. It's responsible for more automatic functions. And then you also have the hindbrain. And this is also evolutionarily older and more automatic functions. And the hindbrain includes the pons, medulla oblongata, and it also includes the cerebellum. So the best way to think about this organization is that you have this sort of very internal, evolutionarily early part, okay? And then you have the things that have started to build on top of that are responsible for more complex behaviors, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And then what's built on top of that, the cerebral cortex or the cerebrum, that is responsible for the most complex behaviors and the different types of learning. We're going to talk a little bit more about the hindbrain. Okay, to go back, that is this right here. This is responsible for lots of autonomic functions. So the medulla right here at the bottom, this is responsible for vital reflexes such as breathing, heart rate, vomiting, salivation, coughing, and sneezing. This is why you can, if you have damage here, then it can cause problems with breathing, irregular heartbeat. And then you have the pons, which is right above here. Actually, this is right, this outside right here, the pons. And this, along with the medulla, contains the reticular formation and the RAF system. These work in conjunction to increase arousal and readiness of other parts of the brain. So this would work with parts of your, the other parts of your forebrain, your hypothalamus, your thalamus, and other parts of your cortex to get you ready. Then you have the cerebellum. This helps regulate motor movement, balance, and coordination. Okay? And this is also important for shifting attention between auditory and visual, and we'll be talking more about that later on. So these structures make up the hindbrain. And here you have a little bit of a closer inspection into what comprises the cerebellum. And inside the cerebellum is first the subcortical nuclei, which will connect a lot of the information here. And then you have white matter, and then you have cerebral cortex gray matter. And the cerebellum is, some people even think of it as its own little sort of brain with its own little organization, because it of course highly interacts with the other brain, but it is quite distinct in terms of location, and it has its own sort of unique organization of gray matter. And really, this is going to have a huge element of the different types of complex movement that we can have. As humans, we can engage in a very wide array of movement, much more so than lots of other species. So we have a much, much more complex cerebellum than other species. So generally the size and even the sort of folding of your cerebellum corresponds with the types of complex movement that your species can make. Okay, now we're going a little bit above to the midbrain. Okay, so the midbrain includes the tectum, which is the roof of the midbrain. This is involved in sensory processing, the superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. It's a lot easier to read than to say. And this is involved in visual and auditory processing. Then you have the tegmentum. This contains nuclei for cranial nerves and other parts of the reticular formation. Now, nuclei, that's a term that you'll read a fair amount about, and they'll use it relatively throughout the textbook. And you say, well, what's nuclei? Nuclei is basically a collection of cells. So it's a collection of cells that's responsible for a particular thing. And so the tegmentum contains the nuclei for the cranial nerves. And the substantia nigra, this gives rise to dopamine-containing pathway, and this facilitates readiness for movement. And it's also going to be involved in elements of reward. So the substantia nigra, because of its involvement with dopamine, and dopamine is really important or critical for reward-seeking behavior and learning rewarding information. So the substantia nigra can be different in people that have dopamine deficiency disorders, such as Parkinson's disease. And then you also have the periodactyl gray matter, and this surrounds the third and fourth ventricles, and this is for species-specific behavior. And so you can find everything over here, your cerebellum, your inferior colliculus, the superior colliculus. This receives visual input. These together make up the tectum. And again, here you have your ventral and your dorsal. So you're taking out this section right here, you're turning it around right here, and then you're looking at this particular section, this particular slide. And this here, these are some of the nuclei, these collection of cells, the substantia nigra, the periodactyl gray matter, the superior colliculus. So within this section of the hindbrain, these are these particular groupings of cells that are responsible for particular processing of information. Now we also have the diencephalon. So the diencephalon integrates sensory and motor information on its way to the cerebral cortex. So information comes in from the peripheral into the spinal cord, okay? And then this is the diencephalon right in here. So you can see that basically, like, okay, here, this is your spinal cord information that's going to come up here, and it's going to pass in this this area right here. This is where your diencephalon is. And this is going to combine information, say, from your right and your left hand, or it can combine pain and touch information into one more sort of comprehensive integration. And so this is basically another sort of relay station or stopover. So you get the brain stem, more automatic information coming up through here, and then you start to integrate this sensory information, and then you're going to process it in these higher cortical areas. So one thing I want to, aspects of this course are going to be a little bit overwhelming in the beginning because you're going over some real fundamental basic biology. But once you start to get a handle on how it's organized, and that will take a little bit of time, then you'll feel a lot more comfortable. So if this is a little bit overwhelming right now, really don't worry too much. Try to do everything that you can to try to organize the content that you're learning, because this will put you in the best position. But it'll just take a little bit of time for you to figure out how to basically map the new information that you're getting as part of this course with some of your existing information about the structure and function of the body. So here's the diencephalon. Okay. You have the thalamus. This integrates information from all sensory informations, and so before it is sort of sent into the neocortex. Then you also have the hypothalamus. This is multiple nuclei that control temperature, regulation, eating, drinking, and sexual behavior. We'll be talking about these a lot more. So here you have the hypothalamus and pituitary glands that are right in here. You can see this. You look at this sort of quadrant, for example. There's a diencephalon. And then here you have this section right up here. This is the right thalamus. Okay, so you have the thalamus, and then you have the hypothalamus. The thalamus is a sensory integration sort of pathway, and the hypothalamus controls lots of regulation behaviors, temperature regulation, eating, drinking. And then you have the pineal gland, which is down here. Where is it actually? There's the pituitary stalk, the pituitary gland, and they may not have a picture of it on here. Yeah, so then you have the pineal gland. This is responsible for the daily biological clock, and we'll be talking about that later on in chapter 13. And then you also have the third ventricle, and this gives rise to the dopamine-containing pathway that facilitates readiness for movement. So the main things that you're going to want to know about are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And here you can see the organization in another way, and it shows you the fourth ventricle. And then you have the thalamus in here, and then you have the third ventricle, and these are the lateral ventricles. And all of these, there's cerebrospinal and fluid in here, and they contain essential nutrients. Okay, so the forebrain, and again, the forebrain is the more sort of evolutionary recent. This includes the cerebral cortex, or also known as the neocortex. And the cerebral cortex, this includes all the regions of the brain that most of the regions of the brain that we've been talking about so far, the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes. We're going to be spending a great deal of learning about really the functions of the forebrain. That's where we're going to be spending most of our time for this course, because the forebrain comprises the cerebral cortex, cognitive functions such as thinking, planning, and language. The cerebral cortex includes the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobes, and the frontal lobes. And then you have this sort of more internal regions here that you can see a little bit in this view. This includes the basal ganglia, which controls voluntary movement, and the limbic system, which regulates emotions and behaviors that create and require memory, and it also contains the hippocampus and the amygdala. So in addition to the thalamus and the hypothalamus, a great deal of the focus of the class is going to be on parts of the forebrain.